Perform qualitative risk analysis is a process of prioritizing individual project risks for further analysis or action by assessing their probability of occurrence and impact as well as other characteristics. The key benefit of this process is that it focuses efforts on high priority risks. This process is performed throughout the project as from PMBOK Guide page 419. What does qualitative mean? It really means a subjective measure. Suppose a friend calls and says that they're at the beach and asks if you would like to join them. You ask, how warm is it? A qualitative answer might be cold, cool, warm, very warm, hot or very hot. And a quantitative answer would be 10 degrees, 18 degrees, 23.5 degrees or whatever. In terms of risk management, a qualitative assessment of a risk probability of occurrence might be low, medium, high, very high or extreme. But a quantitative assessment of a risk probability would be a percentage such as 75.89%. The purpose of the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process is to prioritize the list of individual project risks by doing a simple assessment of both probability of occurrence and likely impact of the risk on the project. Just the same as your friend's assessment of the temperature, these are simple subjective measures based on gut instinct of the project team and other stakeholders. The PMBOK Guide says effective assessment therefore requires explicit identification and management of the risk attitudes of key participants in the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process. Risk perception introduces bias into the assessment of identified risks, so attention should be paid to it. Identifying bias and correcting for it. What does this mean about attitudes and bias? Let's think of your friend wanting to go to the beach. The temperature is cool, but your friend knows that you're unlikely to go to the beach if the temperature isn't at least warm. Your friend doesn't want to be alone, and so they say, it's warmish here. That's a bias. For an example of a bias in a project, suppose there are two options for doing something and a stakeholder really wants option A rather than option B. The stakeholder may be tempted to exaggerate the risks in option B and play down the risks in option A. And then there's the individual stakeholders' attitudes. You have to take those into consideration too. A stakeholder with a low risk appetite will rate risks too highly, and a stakeholder with high risk appetite will risk rates too low. If you use a trained facilitator to support the Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis process, this can reduce the effects of bias. However, on a project I was managing many years ago, it was a large high visibility project and senior management provided a facilitator that they've used before. We went to a nearby hotel for 2 days for the qualitative risk management assessment sessions so that there wouldn't be any interruptions. Now, I'd never met this facilitator before. However, I had suspicions in day one, but by day two, there was no doubt. I realized that not only was this facilitator very competent and experienced, but he was also very biased. Even his words were carefully chosen. He was using NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, to subtly steer every conversation in a particular direction. Obviously, someone on the senior management team had a hidden agenda. I said nothing at the time because senior managers with hidden agendas can be really mean and nasty, and they can do a lot of damage because they're at a much higher level in the organisation than you are. But when we later performed the qualitative risk session, we didn't need a facilitator because now we're just doing really complicated calculations. I invited back the original group of stakeholders and I told them we'll go through the qualitative risk assessment quickly again just to make sure nothing has changed. And this time, without the facilitator, we got a fair view of the risks instead of somebody else's strongly biased view. Although qualitative risk assessments are quite simple and subjective, they're good enough for ranking and prioritising risks so that you know which risks to plan responses for first, and under normal circumstances, biases among the stakeholders tend to cancel out. You will also normally assign a risk owner at this stage to be responsible for each risk. This person will help with the risk response planning and ultimately make sure it is being implemented. Perform qualitative risk analysis also lays the foundation for perform quantitative risk analysis if this process is required. So why wouldn't quantitative risk analysis be required? Quantitative risk analysis is expensive, complicated and very time consuming, and in small projects it simply can't be justified. On the exam, watch out for a question something like, you are managing a small project, you are very experienced as a project manager, you have completed your qualitative risk analysis thoroughly, and possible answers are A, you must now perform quantitative risk analysis, B, double check your qualitative risk analysis again because you are very thorough, C, skip quantitative risk analysis, D, perform a sensitivity analysis. Normally on the exam, any answer that involves skipping a process is a bad choice because PMI expects you to do all of them, but this is one rare exception. Keys are, project is very small, project manager very experienced, qualitative risk management has been completed, therefore quantitative risk management is not required. Sorry, it's so hard to say qualitative and quantitative. The perform qualitative risk analysis process is performed regularly throughout the project lifecycle as defined in the risk management plan. Often in an agile environment, the perform qualitative risk analysis process is conducted before the start of each iteration. So you're actually going to be doing it many times, but just for that particular scope of work. Perform qualitative risk analysis inputs. Input number 1 is the project management plan. The risk management plan is included in the project management plan. Of particular interest to the perform qualitative risk analysis process are the roles and responsibilities for conducting risk analysis, the budgets for risk management, schedule activities for risk management, risk categories, often defined in a risk breakdown structure, definitions of probability and impact, and probability and impact metrics, and stakeholders' risk thresholds. These inputs are often tailored to the project during the planned risk management process. For the exam, please remember if the above details are not included in the risk management plan, they may be developed during this process, but if they're developed during this process, you will need to get the details approved by the sponsor before they are used. Input number 2, project documents. Project documents that can be considered as inputs for this process would include the assumption log. The assumption log is used for identifying, managing and monitoring risk, key assumptions and constraints that may affect the project. These may inform the assessment of the priority of individual project risks. Risk register, it contains details of each identified individual project risk that will be assessed during the perform qualitative risk analysis process, and the stakeholder register, because this includes details of project stakeholders who may be nominated as risk owners. Number 3, enterprise environmental factors. Here we're looking at industry studies of similar projects and published materials including commercial risk databases or checklists. For mature industries such as construction, oil, gas, mining and so on, there's a lot of published data for use on projects rather than having to rediscover it yourself. Input number 4, organizational process assets. The organizational process assets that can influence perform qualitative risk insurance include information about qualitative risk analysis from similar completed projects. Perform qualitative risk analysis tools and techniques. Number 1, no surprise, expert judgment. You're looking for expertise from groups or individuals with specialized knowledge or training in the following topics: previous similar projects and qualitative risk analysis. Expert judgment is often obtained through facilitated risk workshops or interviews. The possibility of expert views being biased should be taken into account in the process, as we've mentioned before. Tools and techniques number 2, data gathering. Techniques that can be used for this process include interviews. Structured or semi-structured interviews can be used to assess the probability and impacts of individual project risks as well as other factors. The interviewer should promote an environment of trust and confidentiality in the interview setting to encourage honest and unbiased assessments. Chosen techniques. Number 3, data analysis. Techniques that could be used during this process include risk data quality assessment. Risk data quality assessment evaluates the degree to which the data about individual project risks is accurate and reliable as a basis for qualitative risk analysis. Risk data quality may be assessed by a questionnaire measuring the project stakeholders' perceptions of various characteristics, which may include completeness, objectivity, relevancy and timeliness. A weighted average of selected data quality characteristics can then be generated to give an overall quality score. And just to remind you that questionnaire and survey are not interchangeable terms. A questionnaire is a series of questions which produces feedback, and the feedback from the questionnaire is then analysed by a survey. Then risk probability and impact assessment. Risk probability assessment considers the likelihood that a specific risk will occur. Risk impact assessment considers the potential effect on one or more project objectives such as schedule, cost, quality or performance. Impacts will be negative for threats and positive for opportunities. Probability and impact are assessed for each identified individual project risk. Risk can be assessed in interviews or meetings with participants selected for their familiarity with the types of risks recorded in the risk register. Project team members and knowledgeable persons external to the project team are included. The level of probability for each risk and its impacts on each objective are evaluated during the interview or the meeting. Differences in the levels of probability and impact perceived by stakeholders are to be expected, and such differences should be explored. Explanatory detail including assumptions justifying the levels assigned are also recorded. Risk probabilities and impacts are assessed using the definitions given in the risk management plan. See Table 11.1. After you have finished the analysis, you will most likely end up with a bunch of low probability and low impact risks. Rather than simply discarding them, I find it's a good idea to keep at least some of them, the main of the least, and keep them on the risk register in case they become important later. Assessment of other risk parameters. The project team may consider other characteristics of risks in addition to probability and impact when prioritising individual project risks for further analysis and action. These characteristics appear on the exam from time to time. So there's urgency, which is the period of time within which a response to the risk is to be implemented in order for it to be effective. Something that needs to be implemented within the next 2 weeks has a higher urgency than something that can be implemented any time within the next 2 months. Proximity, the period of time before the risk might have an impact on one or more of the project objectives. A short period indicates high proximity. Dormancy, the period of time that may elapse after a risk has occurred before its impact is discovered. A short period indicates low dormancy. Computer hacking can have a very high dormancy. Experts tell us that when hackers break into an organization's computer network, that on average it takes 18 months for it to be discovered. That's quite scary, but true. Manageability, the ease with which the risk owner or owning organization can manage the occurrence or impact of the risk. Where management is easy, manageability is high. Controllability, the degree to which the risk owner or owning organization is able to control the risk's outcome. When the outcome can be easily controlled, controllability is high. Detectability, the ease with which the results of the risk occurring or being about to occur can be detected or recognized. When the risk occurrence can be detected easily, detectability is high. Connectivity, the extent to which the risk is related to other individual project risks. Where a risk is connected to many other risks, connectivity is high. Strategic impact. The potential for the risk to have a positive or negative effect on the organisation's strategic goals. Where the risk has a major effect on the strategic goals, strategic impact is high. Propinquity. The degree to which a risk is perceived to matter by one or more stakeholders. Where risk is perceived to be very significant, propinquity is high. The consideration of some of these characteristics could provide more robust prioritisation of risks than possible by only assessing probability and impact. Tools and techniques number 5, risk categorization. Risks to the project can be categorized by sources of risk, e.g. using a risk breakdown structure, such as the one in figure 11.4. In this case, the risks have been broken into 5 categories: technical, management, commercial and external. And you can see the contributors to each risk category. The actual risk categories will depend upon the project and the project environment. The PMBOK is not prescriptive and figure 4.11 is just a suggestion. You will record the risk categories in the risk management plan. Risk can also be categorized by common root causes. Dealing with individual risks can be time consuming, but when grouped into categories it's much more efficient because you're focusing on groups of related risks and then applying generic style risk responses. Tools and techniques number 6, data representation. Data representation techniques that can be used during this process include probability and impact matrix. This is probably the most common, and in fact most people can recognize one even if they don't know what it's for. A probability and impact matrix is a grid for mapping the probability of each risk occurrence and its impact on project objectives if the risk occurs. This example matrix shows combinations of probability and impact that allow individual project risks to be developed into priority groups. For example, a risk with a probability of unlikely and an impact of moderate. You just look along the unlikely row until you come to the moderate column and you'll see that they intersect at a rating of low, and a likely major risk has a rating of high. This works okay for simpler projects, but you can see problems such as very high probability risk with an expected impact of medium, high or very high all have the same rating of high. And so does a high probability risk with the impact of high or very high, or a medium risk with a rating of very high. This means that 6 different probability impact combinations all have the same rating, and that can't be right. On a larger project you would find this too vague to be of any real use, because you just have 3 possible ratings on our example chart. The way to improve the situation is to add simple numbers to the words in both the probability and impact, and we use 1 to 5 for each, or simple decimal numbers, and you'll now have 14 possible ratings instead of just 3. If I've counted them correctly, that is. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 15, 16, 20 and 25. That's not 25 options because there's no number 7, 11, 13, 14, 17, 18, 19, 21, 22, 23 or 24. But whether you use words or simple numbers, you still need a method to make them less subjective, because high to one person could be very high to another person, especially if they have a low risk appetite. Table 11.1 shows how we can put some science around this by defining scenarios for the levels. Now we've come to PMBOK guide version of the probability risk impact matrix in figure 11.5. Now this is typical PMBOKism to show opportunities as well as threats, because most organisations use just the negative or threat side of the diagram. Please notice the numbering on this chart. PMI has used 0.1, 0.3, 0.5, 0.7 and 0.9 for the probability, and 0.05, 1, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.8 for the impact, and this now enables 24 combinations. But the principle is exactly the same as for the previous matrix. Risk can now be prioritised for further analysis and planning of risk responses based on their probability and impacts. The probability of occurrence for each individual project risk is assessed as well as its impact on one or more project objectives if it does occur, using definitions of probability and impact for the project as specified in the risk management plan. Individual project risks are assigned to a priority level based on the combination of their assessed probability and impact using a probability and impact matrix. An organisation can assess the risk separately for each objective, e.g. cost, time and scope, by having a separate probability and impact matrix for each. Alternatively, it may develop ways to determine one overall priority level for each risk, either by combining assessments for different objectives or by taking the highest priority level regardless of which objective is affected. Next is hierarchical charts, where risks have been categorized using more than two parameters. The probability and impact matrix cannot be used. Another graphical representations are required. For example, a bubble chart displays 3 dimensions of data where each risk is plotted as a disk or a bubble, and the 3 parameters are represented by the x-axis value, the y-axis value and the bubble size. An example bubble chart is shown in figure 11.10 with detectability and proximity plotted on the x and y axis and impact value represented by the bubble size. Perform qualitative risk analysis outputs. Number 1, project documents updated. Assumption log. During the perform qualitative risk analysis process, your assumptions may be made, your constraints may be identified, and existing assumptions or constraints may be revisited and changed. The assumption log should be updated with this new information. Issue log, similar sort of thing here. It's updated to capture new issues uncovered or changes to currently logged issues. Risk register, updated with new information generated during the perform qualitative risk analysis process. Updates to the risk register may include assessments of probability and impacts for each individual project risk, each priority level or risk score, denominated risk owner, risk urgency information or risk categorization, and a watch list for low priority risks or risks requiring further analysis. Risk report. It's updated to reflect the most important individual project risks, usually those with the highest probability and impact, as well as the prioritized list of all identified risks on the project in summary conclusion. That brings us to the end of Identify Risks. The next lesson is 11.4, Perform Quantitative Risk Analysis. Please read the corresponding chapter in the Preenbok Guide before watching the video.